There is a structure on this planet so large, so old, and so poorly understood that historians have been arguing about it for literally centuries. Not in the conspiracy theory sense. Not did we fake the moon landing arguing. I mean peer-reviewed, published, internationally respected scholars, with access to every excavation, every dynasty record, every satellite image, genuinely, fiercely disagreeing about where it came from, who built it, how they built it, and what it was actually for. The Great Wall of China stretches roughly 13,000 miles. It crosses mountain ranges, deserts, river valleys. Parts of it are more than 2,000 years old. Parts of it were built last century. Some sections rise 7 stories tall. Some have crumbled to knee height. It is the longest structure ever built by human beings, and it is full of genuine mysteries, not fake mysteries, not ancient aliens mysteries, real ones. The kind that show up in academic journals, get argued at international conferences, and occasionally cause Chinese and Western historians to publish very politely worded papers calling each other wrong. Those are the mysteries we are going to talk about today, because here is the thing about the Great Wall. The real story, the actual documented, excavated, peer-reviewed history, is stranger and more dramatic than anything the internet conspiracy crowd has invented. And it involves a cast of characters so brutal, so ambitious, and so absolutely unhinged that you will wonder why no one made a Netflix series about this already. Let us start from the beginning, or rather, let us start with what you think you know, because most of it is wrong. Ask most people about the Great Wall and you will get some version of this story. China has always been surrounded by dangerous nomads. Chinese emperors, starting around 221 BC with the Qin dynasty, decided to build a wall to keep them out. Millions of workers, many of them prisoners and conscripts, were worked to death building it. Some of their bones are in the wall itself. The wall was visible from space. It mostly worked. The end. Almost every single part of that story is either wrong, wildly oversimplified, or actively disputed. The wall is not one wall. It never was. The Great Wall is actually a series of walls built by different states, different dynasties in different centuries for different purposes, sometimes in completely different locations. The Qin dynasty wall, the first major unified version, was built in the 3rd century BC, but there were walls before it. And the wall you see in most photographs, the dramatic stone one running across the mountain ridges near Beijing, that was built by the Ming dynasty between 1368 and 1644 AD. That is nearly 2,000 years after the Qin wall. They are barely the same structure. Second point, visible from space. No, definitively, categorically, embarrassingly no. The wall is about 15 to 30 feet wide at its widest. The human eye cannot resolve an object that narrow from even low Earth orbit. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei confirmed he could not see it from space in 2003. The myth appears to date back to a letter written in 1932 by someone who had never been to space and was just guessing. It went viral before the word viral existed, and it has never died. Third point, the bones in the wall. This one is partially true, which makes it interesting. Workers absolutely died during construction, probably in enormous numbers. Ancient Chinese records describe families searching for bodies along the wall's route. There is a famous folk story, the Ballad of Meng Xiongnu, about a woman who walked thousands of miles to find her husband's remains after he died building the wall, and wept so hard that a section of it collapsed. But forensic archaeology has found very few human remains actually embedded in the structure. The wall was not literally made of bodies. What it was made of, especially in its earliest sections, is far more interesting. Here is a real mystery that real historians genuinely argue about. The logistics of building this thing do not fully add up, not in a fake math way, in a much more subtle and interesting way. The Qin dynasty unified China in 221 BC. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, possibly the most ruthless administrator in human history, immediately began connecting and extending existing wall sections. Ancient records suggest he mobilized somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million workers for this project, which in historical terms is an almost incomprehensible number. The logistical problem is not the labor, it is the supply chain. Those workers needed to eat, every single day, across thousands of miles of remote, mountainous, desert terrain with no roads capable of supporting heavy carts, no refrigeration, no modern transport. Ancient Chinese records themselves describe the supply situation as catastrophic. Workers reportedly starved in large numbers, not because the emperor did not try to feed them, but because the infrastructure to move enough food to the wall simply did not exist yet. Historian Liu Zhuan spent decades studying Qin dynasty construction records and concluded that the mortality rate among wall laborers may have been as high as 30%, not because they were deliberately worked to death, but because the project outpaced the civilization's ability to logistically support it. The emperor knew this. He kept building anyway. And here is where the real puzzle starts. Because the early Qin wall, the sections we can date most confidently to the 3rd century BC, was not built from stone. It was built from rammed earth, layers of soil and gravel compacted into solid blocks using wooden frames. Fast to build, cheap, available anywhere. The stone wall, the dramatic and clearly engineered stone wall, came much later, and some of it was built using a material that engineers today still cannot fully explain. To understand why the wall was built, you need to understand who it was built against. And this is where the history gets genuinely wild. North of China, stretching across what is now Mongolia, Kazakhstan and Siberia, lived a confederation of nomadic tribes known as the Xiongnu. And the Xiongnu were not, as Chinese imperial propaganda liked to portray them, simple barbarians who needed to be kept out. They were one of the most sophisticated military forces in the ancient world. The Xiongnu invented composite cavalry tactics that would not appear in European warfare for another 5 centuries. Every Xiongnu warrior was trained from childhood to shoot a bow with accuracy at full gallop. Their armies could cover ground at speeds that settled infantry-based civilizations simply could not match or predict. They did not have fixed cities to destroy, fixed supply lines to cut, or fixed assets to threaten. They appeared, they raided, they vanished. Conventional armies could not beat them, not reliably, so China tried something different. If you cannot defeat a cavalry force in the open field, remove the open field. Build a wall long enough that they cannot ride around it. Place watchtowers every few miles so that smoke signals can warn of approach faster than the cavalry can move. Man it with enough soldiers that any raid faces immediate armed resistance before it can escape. It was a strategic masterstroke. It was also, possibly, the most expensive military project in human history relative to the GDP of the civilization that built it. And here is the part the history books gloss over. It did not fully work. The Xiongnu did not stop raiding because of the wall. They adapted. They bribed local commanders. They found unguarded sections. They occasionally breached it directly. The Han dynasty, which came after the Qin and inherited the wall, spent enormous resources both maintaining it and simultaneously paying tribute to the Xiongnu to reduce raids. China was, at various points, paying its enemy to not attack the wall it had nearly bankrupted itself building. That tension, the gap between what the wall symbolized and what it actually achieved, runs through the entire 2,000-year history of this structure. Let me tell you about the man who started all of this. Because Qin Shi Huang is one of the most extraordinary and terrifying figures in human history, and his relationship with the wall tells you something important about what it actually was. Qin Shi Huang unified 6 warring states through a combination of military genius, absolute ruthlessness, and administrative innovation that was centuries ahead of its time. He standardized weights, measures, currency, and written script across a territory the size of Western Europe. He built a road network. He began the wall. He also buried 460 scholars alive for disagreeing with him, burned books he found politically inconvenient, and reportedly became so paranoid about assassination, there were multiple attempts, that he slept in a different room every night and executed anyone who revealed his location. He was also obsessed with immortality. Ancient records describe him sending expeditions of hundreds of young men and women to mythical eastern islands to find the elixir of eternal life. They never came back. Historians debate whether they found somewhere nice and decided not to return, or whether they simply died at sea. The wall for Qin Shi Huang was not just a military installation. It was a statement. It was the physical boundary of civilization, his civilization, against everything he considered chaos. The wall did not just keep the Xiongnu out. It defined what China was. Everything south of the wall was order, law, empire. Everything north was outside the system. This symbolic function is something historians argue about as much as the military one. Was the wall primarily defensive? Or was it primarily a political tool, a way for emperors to demonstrate power, to mobilize populations, to justify taxation, to give the bureaucracy something enormous to administer? Several historians have made compelling cases that the wall's symbolic and economic functions were as important as its military ones. The British historian David Waldron has argued that large stretches of the wall were more useful as trade regulation infrastructure, controlling who and what moved between the steppe economy and the Chinese economy, than as a military barrier. The wall had gates. It always had gates, and at those gates there was commerce. Now here is where we get into the stuff that genuinely makes engineers uncomfortable. The Ming dynasty, the builders of the wall sections you see in most photographs, needed a mortar that could hold enormous stone blocks together across mountain ridges, through freezing winters, across seismic zones for centuries. They found a solution. And it worked so well that some sections of Ming Wall are today in better structural condition than modern concrete buildings constructed in the 1960s. The mortar's secret ingredient was sticky rice. I know how that sounds, But in 2010, a team of researchers at Zhejiang University published a study in the journal Accounts of Chemical Research that analyzed mortar samples from Ming Dynasty walls across multiple sites. They found that the mortar contained amylopectin, a polysaccharide found in glutinous rice, mixed with standard lime mortar. The amylopectin filled microscopic gaps in the crystalline structure of the lime as it cured, creating a composite material that was, in several measurable ways, stronger and more water-resistant than modern Portland cement. The researchers tested reproduction batches. The sticky rice mortar resisted plant growth better than pure lime mortar, meaning weeds and tree roots, which are one of the primary forces that destroy ancient stonework, could not penetrate it as easily. Its compressive strength matched or exceeded modern cement in several tests. The Ming builders had, through centuries of empirical experimentation, developed a biological composite building material that materials scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. This is not mythology. This is published, peer-reviewed chemistry, and it raises a question that nobody has fully answered. How long did it take to figure that out? How many failed batches, collapsed sections, and wasted harvests preceded the moment someone realized that cooking rice water into your mortar made it last forever? The engineering knowledge embedded in that wall was not written down in any manual we have found. It was accumulated across generations, tested at scale, and then largely forgotten when the Ming dynasty fell. Now let us talk about Tartary, because this word comes up constantly in Great Wall conspiracy content, and the real history behind it is genuinely fascinating, even if it is nothing like what those videos claim. On European maps from roughly the 1300s through the 1800s, the vast territory north and east of China was labeled Tartaria, or Tartary. This label covered an enormous area, from Eastern Europe through Central Asia to the Pacific. And conspiracy content has seized on this to argue that Tartary was a hidden empire that was erased from history, and that the Great Wall was actually built by Tartarians to keep China out. Here is what Tartary actually was. It was a geographic label, a catch-all term used by European cartographers to describe lands they did not have detailed knowledge of, roughly corresponding to the territories of various Turkic and Mongolic peoples. It comes from the word Tartar, which itself referred to a group of Turkic tribes. Europeans expanded it into a general label for the entire steppe region, the same way they used terms like the Orient or the Indies to describe vast areas with enormous internal diversity. There was no Tartarian empire. There was no unified Tartarian civilization. What there was a series of incredibly powerful nomadic confederacies, the Xiongnu, the Scythians, the Huns, the Mongols, the Timurids, who rose and fell across the steppe over 2 millennia. Some of them did, in fact, conquer China. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan and his successors, conquered the largest contiguous land empire in history, which included all of China. They ruled it for nearly a century as the Yuan dynasty. And here is the genuinely interesting historical irony that nobody in the conspiracy world seems to have noticed. The Mongols did not need the Great Wall to fall. The wall did not stop them. Genghis Khan's armies went around it, through it, and over it. The wall was simply not a meaningful obstacle to a sufficiently motivated and well-organized steppe army. The Ming dynasty, which came after the Mongols and built the wall sections we see today, was building partly in response to the psychological trauma of having been conquered by exactly the kind of people the wall was supposed to stop. Here are the questions that professional historians are still genuinely debating about the Great Wall. These are real academic disputes, not internet speculation. First, was the wall ever actually garrisoned at anything close to its theoretical capacity? Chinese records suggest that maintaining even a fraction of the wall's potential defensive force was a constant fiscal crisis. The wall could theoretically shelter and supply an army of hundreds of thousands. The reality, for most of its history, was a thin and underpaid force of local conscripts who were as likely to defect or desert as to fight. Second, how much of what we call the Great Wall today is original, and how much is Ming restoration or modern reconstruction? This question is more complicated than it sounds. Significant sections of the wall near major tourist sites were substantially rebuilt in the 20th century, sometimes using modern materials and techniques. Historians have raised questions about whether some heavily photographed sections accurately represent original construction. The Chinese government has undertaken restoration projects on a massive scale, and the line between restoration and reconstruction is not always clear. Third, what happened to the detailed construction records? A project of this scale, maintained across multiple dynasties, would have generated enormous amounts of administrative documentation. Supply requisitions, labor roles, engineering specifications, maintenance records. Some records survive, but the volume of documentation you would expect from 2,000 years of continuous construction is simply not there. Wars, fires, deliberate destruction of records from previous dynasties, and simple decay account for some of this, but historians note the gap. Fourth and most fascinating, did the wall actually reduce raiding, or did it simply displace it? Several recent quantitative studies have attempted to correlate wall construction with historical records of raids, and the results are genuinely ambiguous. Some studies find evidence that walled sections saw reduced raiding. Others find that raiders simply moved to unfortified sections, or that the relationship between wall construction and raid frequency is too complex to isolate. The strategic logic of the wall seemed sound. Whether it delivered measurable results is still debated. Here is something about the Great Wall that almost never appears in the popular history. The wall outlasted every dynasty that built it, maintained it, or tried to use it, and every new power that took control of China had to decide what to do with this enormous, crumbling, expensive inheritance. The Qing dynasty, which replaced the Ming in 1644 and ruled China until 1912, famously chose to mostly ignore it. The Qing were Manchu, originally from northeast of the wall. They had come from the outside. The wall had not stopped them. From their perspective, maintaining a structure designed to keep their ancestors out was both expensive and symbolically awkward. So they let much of it decay. For nearly 3 centuries, while European travelers wrote breathless accounts of the magnificent wall, local Chinese populations quietly quarried its stones for houses, roads, and field walls. Entire sections disappeared. The dramatic ruin aesthetic that so many 19th-century European paintings celebrated was, in significant part, active demolition by practical farmers who needed building materials. The wall's modern identity as a symbol of Chinese civilization, a source of national pride, a tourist destination, was largely a 20th-century construction. The nationalist government of the Republic of China in the early 20th century began promoting the wall as a symbol of Chinese strength and endurance. The communist government after 1949 continued this, and eventually formalized it with massive restoration programs. Mao Zedong's famous line, that one is not a true hero until one has climbed the Great Wall, comes from a 1935 poem. It became the basis of a marketing slogan. The wall you visit today, the wall on the posters and the postcards and the drone footage, is in many ways a carefully curated version of something far more complicated. That is not a criticism. That is just history. Every civilization curates its past. The question is whether we are curious enough to look behind the curation. So here is where we land. The Great Wall of China is not what most people think it is. It is not one wall. It is not impenetrable. It did not keep invaders out. It was not visible from space. Parts of it were not even built by Chinese dynasties in any simple sense of that phrase, given that the Mongols and Manchu who conquered China then ruled it and sometimes maintained or extended the wall themselves. What it actually is something far more interesting. It is the physical record of 2,000 years of a civilization trying to solve an impossible problem. How do you defend an agricultural society against a mobile cavalry culture that can strike anywhere, retreat anywhere, and never needs to hold ground? The wall was one answer. Trade agreements were another. Intermarriage between royal families was another. Hiring the nomads as border guards was another. China tried all of these, simultaneously, across centuries. The wall encodes all of that complexity in stone. The rammed earth sections from the Qin era, desperate and massive, and built on the bodies of conscripts. The brick and mortar Ming sections, technically sophisticated, built with sticky rice mortar that outlasted the dynasty itself. The crumbling, quarried sections that tell you what happens to military infrastructure when the geopolitical logic that justified it collapses. The ancient historian Sima Qian, writing in the 1st century BC, described the wall's construction under the first emperor with a word that translates roughly as both magnificent and monstrous. He meant both things. The wall was an achievement of staggering scale and a catastrophe of human cost. And these two things were inseparable. That tension has never really gone away. There are still sections of the wall that have never been fully surveyed. There are foundations that ground-penetrating radar has detected beneath layers of accumulated soil that have not been excavated. There are construction techniques in remote sections that do not match any documented methodology from any dynasty. The wall still has genuine secrets, not supernatural ones, not Tartarian energy machine secrets. Just the ordinary, extraordinary secrets of a very old, very large, very complicated thing that human beings built, and then mostly forgot how to understand. The Great Wall of China does not need invented mysteries. The real ones are more than enough.